How do we fix Facebook, man?
I don't know. I mean, this is such a weird subject. You know, I've been following this for like most of this year, and I've really had a hard time getting people interested in this particular angle of the story, because basically the arc of the whole Facebook thing for me was they brought it up in the context of Russiagate and all those ads, and all the platforms were hauled before the Senate last year, and they were told that they had to come up with a plan, or it was suggested to them that they come up with a plan for preventing the sowing of discord. And within 5 or 6 months, they were all in partnership with groups like the Atlantic Council, which is like a NATO organization.
Yeah.
And they were doing these little test runs of like zapping little sites, and then all of a sudden they started zapping real sites. I thought this would be a big media story, you know, like, because some of these organizations had pretty decent sized followings. You know, there's a thing called Reverb Press, which, you know, you'll see a lot online, or Liberal America is another one. And they just disappeared. Like, some of them were libertarians, some of them were right wing, some of them were, you know, like pro-democratic. And I think it's kind of a harbinger of how the media is going to be dealt with in the future. The sort of Alex Jones model of just sort of removing actors from platforms simultaneously. I don't know. Does that not scare anybody?
I think it's terrifying.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's why, I mean, we've been on the like Facebook is not just lame, it's evil beat for a while, and it seems like, okay, so you have this like big series of actual problems. First and foremost, that Facebook is basically just like this
vast data collection scheme.
Yeah, it's this vast data. That's the business model. One of the great sort of ironies of Facebook is if you watch the Facebook movie, which is okay, the big beef in that movie is between Zuckerberg and I don't remember one. I guess Maine was with the twins, but there's the guy.
Winklevi.
Yeah, but there's a guy that is his friend who he partners with.
Yeah.
And the guy's always like, okay, Mark, like, we need to get advertising on the site. We need to make this something. And he has like the strategic vision that like, no, we're building something bigger than just sticking lame ads on it. But of course, what the movie doesn't get to is it was like, we're not going to stick lame ads on it because we're going to create a massive private surveillance system where the ads can be micro-targeted and sophisticated and absolutely invasive. So the reason we're not doing these little ad campaigns isn't because of some type of ethic or ethos. We're going to go for the real deep dive.
Yeah, they were the first. Very early in their history, they did those ads that were sort of micro-targeted to college students, right? So I think they were like advertising things like the head of the Charles, like parties and things like that. But the whole idea was they used the data to match the ad to the people, and that's the business model now. Like, instead of having to go on CBS and show an ad to everybody, now you can go to Facebook and say like, well, my target audience is 45-year-old right-wing Christians or something like that,
with erectile dysfunction.
Yeah, with erectile dysfunction.
Little negativity into it. So then, so if we were to say, like, as a timeline, and Corey Pines talked about this a lot on this show too. He wrote this book, Live, Work, 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 Die: A Journey into the Savage Heart of Silicon Valley, and which I think you'd probably really like that book. But he went to Silicon Valley to become a billionaire. Just had like an adventure there. And Silicon Valley is just awful.
Unless you become a billionaire.
His point was that those days are over.
Oh, okay.
And people are still going there based off of this sort of like fake dream, essentially. And also that you couldn't really become a billionaire to begin with unless you went to Stanford. But like that, basically, through the Obama era, Silicon Valley's amassing all this power. They're violating people's privacy. They're building this sort of like stalker economy, and Democrats are essentially totally looking the other way because of campaign contributions and because, Silicon Valley is a sort of like new sort of acceptable place of capitalism for progressives in like the public mind. And then after 2016, Trump wins, and all of a sudden all of these people want to blame Facebook instead of their own political failings, basically.
Right.
And I feel like what you're identifying though is that in both of these scenarios, like there's the big picture questions of what happens when 45% of people say they're getting news from Facebook, and what happens when this company that has zero accountability knows everything about us. And you basically are saying, well, what they've done is they're just outsourcing censorship to essentially right-wing think tanks.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think what they're doing is they're trading a lack of regulation for some political control over the content. And we've seen that in other countries, and this is why I spent a lot of time in this piece going into how they behave in Israel, how they behave, in other parts of the world, that they will have either formal or informal relationships with governments to regulate content. And they previously, in the United States anyway, always had this kind of hands-off attitude about it, and everybody was fine with it as long as, Donald Trump wasn't winning the election.
Right.
In fact, if you remember, there were lots of stories after 2012 talking about how one of the reasons Obama won re-election is because they had such a skillful Facebook campaign. But the reverse happened this time around, and now it's not just Facebook. It's Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Spotify. They all seem to be. I mean, it's hard to report because you can't say definitively that they're acting in concert. They all denied to me that they were, but you keep seeing situations where a person or a media outlet will disappear from 3 or 4 of the platforms in the same couple of days, and that's troubling, right?
I mean, even if it isn't even if they're not on a call together,
right,
you're setting a template.
Yeah.
And that, so is it, I guess being a socialist, I always just say, yeah, these platforms have major implications for speech and for journalism. And they're private platforms, so you can't do anything about it. So the way you have to do is you basically, I advocate just making them public utilities essentially, and then the First Amendment would protect them. Like, what is that? Does that make sense to you? What did the Europeans figure this out? Do they have some?
The Germans have a formal law that governs this. I mean, it's a little simpler over there because they have hate speech laws that they can just apply directly to. Right. And so they've kind of created a system. They've built these things they call deletion centers, which sounds really creepy to me.
It sounds so fucking creepy.
But yeah, no. The problem with all of these platforms is that they're essentially unregulated media regulators. They're non-transparent media regulators. Like you think about Google, it has an algorithm, and the way the algorithm works determines what order you see content in. Like, they've decided that they're going, like, for instance, the metaphor they used for me was, well, in the old days, if you entered baseball in your search engine, the local Little League team would come up. Now we've shifted the emphasis from specificity to authority, right? Or relevance to authority. So now instead of the local Little League team, you'll see MLB.com.
And that's a much more subjective. I mean, I get, MLB, sure, but relevancy feels like that's a more sort of, that's a less subjective metric.
Yeah. So the metric they'll send you, they'll show you how the survey works. Basically, they're looking for things like, does the outlet have a lot of Pulitzer Prize awards, right? So the thing that really was stunning to me was the World Socialist website. It doesn't actually, no matter how you feel about it, they don't really have factual problems. They're very professionally run. It has a clear message. There's no fraud involved,
Totally.
right? So if you enter Trotsky or Trotskyism, you're more likely to get an article in the New York Times about Trotskyism than you are to get the leading Trotskyite website in the world. And that's a big change. Like they started,
and that's a
making
big problem.
Yeah.
It's also not very authoritative.
right. Yeah,
If I want to read about Trotskyites, I want to read them, not Barry fucking Weiss.
right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but that's a major sea change, you know. And they just sort of did it in early 2017, and the problem with that is that they, you know, when they make changes to their algorithm, nobody knows. They don't announce it. You don't know what the changes are, and it's impossible for media companies to really keep pace with changes if they don't know exactly what the metric is. So it's very difficult. I mean, I think it's a big issue, but
You see people, yeah. I mean, and so that was like I don't have, in the relative world we're in, which is a problem. I don't have any, like, cool, Alex Jones is hurt. That's great. Fuck Alex Jones. Whatever. I actually kind of miss doing content about him.
yeah.
But it's a lot, actually. But I feel like, but it was just amazing how people totally missed this sort of bigger picture takeaway, which is like all of these platforms just gone.
Right.
And if you think, I guess this is always my argument to the left. It's like the reason that I'm mostly very opposed to deplatforming, I have no problem with using it strategically, and I think there's fringe benefit. Like, there's a benefit to him being gone. But like, if you think that a line that starts with Alex Jones is going to go and encompass the right and not quickly pivot to
Black Lives Matter.
Black Lives Matter
Yeah.
to, well, or I mean, I feel like even on this show, right? We've done content like with real journalists, real filmmakers on the CIA crack connection in the 80s. That's a real story.
Yeah.
The DEA and El Chapo is a real story. It's a real enough story that they're literally keeping it out of court proceedings right now as we speak. And also heroin in Afghanistan. But if you just have like that sounds weird. What do you mean? Government and drugs. That sounds like Alex Jones type thing. And if your vetters are staffed up center-right establishment think tanks, you think that they're going to be curious about, covering that type of story or supporting people's right to cover it rigorously? I mean, of course not.
No, and it's just frustrating because people can't see around the corner to the logical next step with all this. We just so carefully built up over decades a system for dealing with bad speech that was intentionally slow.
Right.
The bar was intentionally really high. There's a reason why it's really hard to get successfully sued for libel. Like the courts are really specific. Like we want people to not self-censor, right? Because we want to encourage them to have dialogues about things. So if they're afraid,
we want Trump and Ivanka jokes.
yeah, exactly.
Want them. I'm here to provide them.
That's what you're gonna do. Exactly.
Positive energy.
Well, this is like the asymmetry on the right? Like,
yes,
because they can play this game, and if they get the leftist banned, then that's good for them. And if they don't get the leftist banned, then they can say, well, why do you ban them or why don't you ban them when you ban us?
And look at it from like, let's bring in the Gramscian like hegemony, right? Because they also can sacrifice, like, at the end of the day, even if the Mercers or whoever else is chipping some money for somebody like Milo, doesn't matter. Like, it can be useful for 6 months and then he self-emulates and it's gone. And the broader infrastructure of funding right-wing think tanks, right-wing personalities, there's always going to be an endless flow of money and an endless home field advantage for those people. Mm-hmm. So, they can both play it both ways you're talking about. And they also can essentially just like fund AstroTurf journalism, which can go too far in individual cases and then get pulled off of the field. Whereas, like, I mean, another example for this show, I know Brazil Wire, which we used, because I'm very serious about what's happening in Brazil and the Bolsonaro and the Lula case and the landless people's murders. They're like an indispensable English language source, and they are absolutely punished by Facebook's algorithms. And I mean, you're going to tell me that people in the Atlantic Council haven't? That's so obvious. Like, who wants to favor that?
Or Telesur.
Telesur has been punished. Exactly.
Yeah, they've been yanked a bunch of times from a bunch of platforms. There was one this week that was really weird. Which there's this thing on Twitter. It's Optisanitize, which is it's a site that is pretty much dedicated to showing footage of war crimes in Yemen.
Right.
And
we've retweeted some of their stuff. That's just trying to bring the fact that we are enabling mass murder there every day to public attention.
Yeah. So they got yanked. And there was a little bit, they got yanked once, then people complained, they got reinstated, then they got yanked again, and now that's it. And so this is what's going to, this is what drives me crazy. This is what's going to be the future now is there's going to be almost no way for anybody who's an alternative news outlet that has any kind of slightly, controversial opinion to navigate itself to a wider audience, because there's going to be a fear of getting zapped because of this dueling tattletale problem. Like the right is going to be trying to get
tattletale problem.
Well, that's what it is.
That's exactly what it is. That's perfect.
You're
This
gonna
is a tattletale society. It needs to stop.
It's crazy. There's mass reporting on the right and there's mass reporting on the left, and then people get taken off. Then they get a demerit, which.
But what is the But see, that's the bigger problem in the culture right now, and it's a bigger problem on the left because, as I say, practically there's all these inbuilt advantages on the right. Like, I remember this story that Douglas Lane was telling me about his son going to these really important demonstrations at the University of Oregon against tuition hikes, and the students got in really serious trouble. I think some of them were almost on the border of being expelled for these protests. And then in this total non sequitur, their answer was, well, you have these like pro-life demonstrators also disrupting things. Why aren't they also getting in trouble?
Right.
Versus, are you fucking kidding me? We're going to be out tomorrow double the size to lower the tuition hikes and protest that you're threatening our speech.
Right.
Sure, of course I'm pro-choice, of course, but that's not like that bizarre, like, instead of taking on the structure, well, why don't they get that? It's so fucking weird how that's disseminated. And it's never going to win on our side because they have the resources for that kind of petty bullshit.
Yeah.
You see it a lot on Twitter now too, especially with leftists. It's like very much they're always trying to get Twitter to ban certain accounts.
I don't want them to be banned. I want them to be exposed and embarrassed.
More often than not, the Twitter will ban left-wing people just for like defending themselves from like horrible misogynist attacks or something. They curse or whatever at them and they'll pull their account.
Right.
And it's one of those things. Is like, why are we celebrating Twitter, this private company, this small group of individuals, pulling people off of a platform that is so influential for a lot of people now? I mean, that's the real deal here. It's like you have Facebook and Twitter. They've really have become such a central point of communication and development, and like that's how most people get their news. And they've taken that power, and now we're seeing this complete destruction of of that open space. And what's everyone doing? They're all returning. Now they're being forced to return to New York Times, MSNBC, all these outlets that were thoroughly discredited over the past 15, 20 years.
Right.
That's why people were looking for alternative. That's why people were on Twitter and Facebook, was to get different sources of information. And now they've returned it back to them. It's pretty wild.
Yeah, right. That's exactly the point. Like these sort of smaller outlets, they're there for a very specific reason. They wouldn't exist if the normal news outlets were doing a better job. And they grew up, especially. I don't think it's an accident that there was a real explosion of them after the WMD thing. People stopped trusting the New York Times, all those outlets.
Well, we were talking about the Ezra Klein thing today, and the Ezra Klein Paul Ryan, and I was
Ezra
looking
Klein
at those old
sort of facilitating Paul Ryan.
Yeah, and looking at a 2010 blog post of Ezra saying people are calling me out for giving this guy the benefit of the doubt, but come on, look at these charts. And the top comment
Christ.
that was published 13 minutes after Ezra Klein posted that was, yeah, he's not arguing in good faith, you idiot. And
now Ezra Klein sees that 8 years later.
Yeah, basically.
Right.
But I think that's why I
yeah.
stopped reading Wonk blog, right? It's those sorts of things where it's what the fuck is this?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And if you open up the terrain, there's going to be people who are going to tell you, no, Paul Ryan is full of shit, and I'll explain why and not use polite language. And there's going to be people who say that the frogs are gay.
Right.
That's that's literally what having an open society is.
Well, I mean, the internet is full of all kinds of weird shit. I mean, there's Bigfoot sites, there's Scientology,
right. That's it.
The reason it was interesting and a little messed up too. I mean, the porn aspect, whatever, but the ability for people to be able to reach each other on these weird subcultures all around the world and to build up sort of smaller readerships around specific issues, all that stuff's great. That was a great feature of the internet. And what they're going to do with this is they're going to homogenize it, and they're going to incentivize everybody to self-censor and to behave a certain way because they're not going to want to lose their businesses. A lot of these people have invested a lot of money in this. And, I talk to people who spent $300,000 and $400,000 on boosting tools on Facebook. If they get zapped, that's it. They're lost their life savings.
And these platforms are always lying about their metrics anyways. They have no transparency, and people have literally a couple years ago, I mean, you mentioned in the piece, but everybody's I know video, got to do video, and then Facebook was yeah, we were lying.
Yeah, exactly.
We that whole video model, that was just a lie.
Yeah.
So Cheryl had this idea to lie on her way.
Sorry for the copy editors you laid off in the meantime.
Yeah, sorry about that. Mark will be meeting a cow later. If you're interested, maybe you should post about that. Keep it positive.
Yeah. No, it's scary.
You just enjoyed that Michael Brooks Show video, and you can get a lot more by subscribing to us here at the Michael Brooks Show YouTube channel. It's literally right there.